The Objective. To deliver the NBA to you like no other. News. Play breakdowns. Power rankings. Storylines you never hear talked about anywhere else. It's all straight shots here. Fired by straight shooters. S and Gun. This is the Objective Basketball Podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Objective Basketball Podcast. S here joining you as always. Lauren, not here, dealing with something right now. She'll be back. We'll probably do some kind of live podcast or something from Vegas. We'll figure it out once we get there. But joining us today is a good friend, a compatriot, if you will, when it comes to the Philadelphia 76ers and all the drama, all the things that happen, Sixers basketball, but also a great NBA mind in general, Bryan Toporek. Bleacher Report senior multi-platform editor, but also a contributor for Forbes Sports and Liberty Ballers. He is also the co-host of the NBA podcast. Bryan, how are you today, given the circumstances of the Philadelphia 76ers?
Can't they just have like one normal summer? That's all I want. Just one normal summer. It's every year. It's always something. But thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here. I'm less excited to talk about the Sixers, but the 29 other teams. Let's go.
It's funny, and we'll get into our winners and losers of free agency a little bit later. But I mean, it's sort of fresh in my mind about James Harden. And, you know, every time we kind of interact on Twitter, maybe it feels like we're always talking about some kind of craziness that is happening in Sixers world, whether it be Ben Simmons, whether it be the MVP debate between Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic. And now James Harden is another, you know, situation here, if you will. It's funny looking back at the last 3 or 4 years of Harden's career and how much it's kind of just bounced back and forth based on whatever objective he has, whatever personal objective he has in his career, whatever objective he has in terms of the team that he's on. And it's strange to me that we've gotten to this point because we've seen him shapeshift in a lot of ways. We saw him shapeshift maybe the most this season in Philadelphia. And yet we're still back at square one, it feels like. How do you digest all that?
Honestly, I'm just laughing through it all at this point because I think the alternative is a lot bleaker. Yeah. You know, it's funny because he keeps bringing up, or at least throughout the season, he kept bringing up like all the sacrifices he made. You know, he opted out last year, took $14 million less so they could sign PJ Tucker and sign Daniel House and stay under the hard cap. And then, you know, as you said, style of play, like, I mean, he just hadn't had a high usage center that he's played with before. So like the ball was still in his hands a ton. I mean, it's not like they were asking him to just stand in the corner like they did with PJ Tucker and like Tyrese Maxey is running the half court offense. You know, he was running the half court, but you know, you're not leaning on him to be a 30 points per game scorer, which I don't think he really has in him anymore. Is
that what he wants? Is that like
I don't know. Like I wish I
assess. Yeah,
because like Chris Haynes has this article in mid-May where, you know, he said Harden at the time was expected to opt out, was pursuing a 4-year deal, and I forget the exact phrasing, but it was something like wanted the basketball freedom to be himself. And I was like, what does that mean? Right. And are we sure that's a good thing at this point in his career?
Yeah, and it's fair. It's fair to ask that question because 34 years old, I believe, if I'm not wrong, looking for a max extension, something along the lines of that, 4 years worth of money. It's tough to see how 38-year-old James Harden would look, or even 37 or 36-year-old James Harden would look. It's tough to
33-year-old James Harden, like, you know, he's had a couple of games like in the playoffs, games 1 and 4 against Boston, where it's like, oh, that's the old James Harden. You're still capable of that. But then he also has games 6 and 7, where it's like, oh, this is just the story of your career. You just tend not to show up at these big important games, and like I just don't think he has the lift and the gas anymore where you can lean on him to be this primary scorer. Like I think the best fit for him is be this playmaker. And, you know, I think he can do that in Philly. I think we'll get into, I'm sure, some of the potential landing spots. Like if he goes to the Clippers, pair him with Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, that makes sense. Like he could be that, but he goes to the Clippers, and not only is he not the number one option, like I don't even think he's the number two option offensively there. So if you're not willing, like there comes a point in every star's career where you have to realize I'm past my prime. Like I need to adjust my game. I'm not going to necessarily be, the 4-year, 35% max guy that I used to be. And, Kyrie, I wonder if that influences his thinking at all, seeing Kyrie only settle for a 3-year deal with the player option. And I think it was close to $10 million less than his max. Like, I don't think, regardless of whether he stays in Philly or whether he goes elsewhere, like, I don't think whichever team is trading for him is giving him a 4-year max deal next offseason. I just don't think that's his market anymore.
Yeah, I don't think it is either. I think it's wishful thinking from Harden's camp to imagine that, he goes to a destination, wherever that may be, whether it's the Clippers or another team, where he will have such an outstanding season that it will deem him a max player again and get him a 4-year deal. I just think that's such a small potential of the outcome. It doesn't seem possible. But ladies and gentlemen, you know what, it is possible. Get in the game and make your next bet with Sports Interaction. Bet before the game or live and play on all your favorite teams' matchups. Head to sportsinteraction.com/SDPN or download the app to get started. 19 plus, please play responsibly. Speaking of playing responsibly, James Harden has not been playing very responsibly. You mentioned some of the struggles. You mentioned some of the struggles, and I think those struggles are fair. I think, some of the noise that has consistently been around him, in December during Christmas, literally Christmas Day, the Houston Rockets, I guess their interest drops. Maybe James Harden's interest in Houston drops. That doesn't happen. They shift over to Fred VanVleet, Mr. Bet on Yourself. We can maybe get into that a little bit later. But overall, it just seems like his priorities are very mixed. And I wonder what that means for his next team, wherever that might be. Speaking of the next team, how long do you think it'll take before Daryl Morey decides to move this guy and kind of shift? Because it just seems like Philly and Embiid and Morey and, Maxey even, they can't go into another season doing the Ben Simmons, he'll sit out, we'll figure it out and kind of hold the fort down as much as we can type of thing. I just don't think that makes sense. Do you?
No, I mean, that's the question. I'm writing or finishing an article about this for Forbes on Wednesday. So I went back to look at all of the details about when he forced his way out of Houston, because I didn't remember the specifics. I remember it was acrimonious at the time, but he had requested trade leading up to training camp. Shows up to training camp late because he was partying with a little baby in Vegas, and this was.
Do you remember the bottle cap
times?
Do you remember the bottle cap? Yep.
And then, it's back during the pandemic, so that he had to spend a week in health and safety protocols. I went back. I didn't remember this part. The first 3 games of that season, he had 30 plus points per game in each of the first 3. Then after that, just goes completely off a cliff. Has a really uninspired performance against the Lakers, gives the press conference afterward where he's like, I just don't think this could be fixed. And then, I think 2 days later, he's a member of the Brooklyn Nets. So, Daryl was gone by that point. Daryl was with Philly by the time Harden started doing all of that. But there is a clear track record. When James Harden is unhappy, he's just going to make life miserable for you and everyone else around you. And I just don't know. The Sixers right now that's the messaging coming out. It's not necessarily that he's played his last game in Philly. If whatever team does not meet our asking price, he's under contract. We are willing to have him come back. I think it's really, really risky, but it's also risky from Harden's perspective, because when he did this stuff in Houston, he was under contract through 21-22. So almost 2 full seasons left on his deal.
Yeah.
Right now, 1-year deal can't be extended because his contract is too short. So he is going to be an unrestricted free agent next offseason. And, if you look at this as your last chance to get big money, maybe, teams didn't have cap space this summer, but maybe they will next summer. You kind of have to not only play ball, but play well. Or I don't think that big money offer is there next summer either.
It is a very weird situation because unlike Houston in that, and like you mentioned, Daryl Morey was not there when Harden was pulling all of these, antics, if you will. Daryl Morey is now in Philly. They have a long-standing relationship. I know he is going to play hardball when it comes to some of these negotiations. They're going to try to get as much as they possibly can. But what is that possible? Like, what is the package here that would satisfy a Daryl Morey? And on the other side of this, apparently Tyrese Maxey won't be traded for prime Michael Jordan. You know what I mean? Right. So they're standing hard and firm on that. So like, where is the compromise here? If you could find one.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. And I'm trying to start reading through the tea leaves because, I think the messaging that has come out about their overall offseason plans is starting to become kind of clear what they're angling for. So, we get the news right before free agency starts. They're not going to extend Tyrese Maxey this offseason. They're waiting until 2024, which, I wrote about as a possibility back in May at Liberty Ballers because I noted, he has a pretty cheap cap hold. He's a $13 million cap hold. Realistically, he's probably going to have like a $30 million starting salary at most, or at least, I should say. So, it's a way to basically create like an extra 17, possibly 20, maybe even more million in cap space next offseason. I was listening to the Hoop Collective earlier. Not only is Tyrese Maxey untouchable, but the Sixers are also batting away suitors for Tobias Harris. And if any team is interested in Tobias, they only want to take back expiring contracts because Tobias is on a $39.3 million expiring deal. So whatever the case, it seems like the Sixers are prioritizing having as much financial flexibility in 2024 as possible. And I say all of that because then we go back to the Clippers, where, Norm Powell is probably the most realistic trade chip that they have to offer. But Norm Powell's under contract for 3 more years. Like, if the Sixers are really prioritizing having all of this cap space, then I don't know that they want Norm Powell on their books for $19.2 million next season. So, Clippers do have other expirings: Marcus Morris, Nick Batum, Robert Covington. I think they would covet Terrence Mann, who's on a 2-year, $22 million deal. But Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports reported that they aren't or that they're expected to, the Clippers are expected to not want to include Mann or Bones Highland. So I'm wondering if the middle ground is, whatever expirings you need to make it work. I'm interested that they acquired KJ Martin the other day because I mean, maybe they want to keep KJ Martin, but the Sixers do have a small trade exception from Matisse Thybulle that KJ Martin would fit into, so there's no aggregation concerns there. So I think it's, financial savings seems to be one of the big priorities, or keeping their books as flexible as possible. I think they would probably look at this as a way to replenish their draft war chest because they could offer 1 first-round pick right now in 2029, and that's it. They don't have a ton of second-rounders either for the next couple seasons. Right. So, that would be my guess. I'm guessing the holdups right now between the Sixers and Clippers are, which of the expirings and or Powell are you guys willing to offer? Are you willing to offer Terrence Mann or Bones Highland? If not, what about KJ Martin? And how many draft picks the Clippers have? They can offer 28 and 30, I believe, and then 27 and 29 pick swaps. They also have a couple second rounders they can offer. So, I think there is a workable deal here between both sides. It's just, I don't know what the Sixers asking price is, and I don't know if the Clippers are going to be willing to meet it, in which case that begs the question, well, what happens then?
From the Clippers' perspective, I just don't understand the reason to withhold Terrence Mann or Bones Highland. And I like those players. I think they provide youthfulness, if you will, to that Clippers roster. I think from a ball handling perspective, they provide some versatility on that end. But I don't think they are game-changing type of players that you withhold the chance of trading a James Harden for. I know for a fact that, the Clippers also withheld Terrence Mann in any deal for Fred VanVleet at the trade deadline. That was, something that the Raptors were not eye to eye on with the Clippers in that moment. So I don't see it necessarily. Maybe Terrence Mann is someone that is a big locker room guy, maybe appreciated in that locker room. But if you're the Clippers, you have Kawhi Leonard, you have Paul George, you don't necessarily have a ton of youthfulness on that roster to look forward to after those guys. So why not go all in? Why not just commit to the Harden, PG, Kawhi core and, ride it to the wheels fall off? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, I mean, I think it was Kevin O'Connor mentioned that they've been interested in PJ Tucker as well, and I wouldn't be shocked if the Sixers are looking at this deal as a way to get off of PJ Tucker's contract, because he's got an $11.5 million player option for 24-25. So, again, if they're prioritizing financial flexibility, and that would actually make it easier to make the math work on both sides. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think like if the the Clippers are saying, we're not including Terrence Mann for James Harden, it's like the Heat saying we're not including Caleb Martin for Damian Lillard. Like you're just not being serious about trying to get these guys, or you're trying. All of these trade negotiations are leverage, right? It's like if James Harden wants to go with the Clippers and James Harden's going to be upset and James Harden's going to make your life hell, you have to trade him this offseason. So we're not going to give you our best offer because no one else wants him. And like Miami with Dame, same thing. Like Dame wants to come here. No one else is going to top our crappy offer. So take it or leave it. But, I think the Sixers and the Blazers are pushing back and like, no, we don't have to trade these guys. We're not just going to settle for whatever slop you throw at us.
So I'm actually glad you brought Dame into this, because that was the next part to this. I think in a lot of ways in the NBA world, Dame has to be the first shoe to drop before we see what happens with Harden. And because everybody is going to be holding back their assets, even the Clippers, who are, reportedly trying to get in on the Dame conversation, they're going to see and essentially what they can do in order to get a guy like Damian Lillard. I could see multiple teams being involved in this, whether it's a 3-team trade, maybe even a 4-team trade. Dare I say a 4-team trade for Damian Lillard. But you mentioned it a little bit when it comes to his demands to go to Miami. He's adamant about going to Miami. There's multiple reports out there that say Miami is the destination for him, irregardless of, Brooklyn and how much he's liked them, et cetera, et cetera. You think at the end of the day, it's going to be Miami with Dame? Or do you think there's going to be a dark horse that comes in and sweeps it up, right? Remember Kawhi? Remember how with the Kawhi situation, nobody guessed Toronto would have been able to get Kawhi. It was the Lakers. There were a couple other teams mentioned, but then at the end, it ended up being the Toronto Raptors. Do you think that there is a possibility that happens with Damian Lillard? Not that he goes to the Raptors, but that another team swoops in and maybe makes this interesting.
I think it's possible. I mean, other teams can very easily beat Miami's offer. Like if Miami had a competitive offer, then that's one thing. But, when their blue chip prospect is Tyler Hero and you're trying to trade him to a team that already has Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, and Anthony Simons, like, okay, that doesn't make sense at all. So now immediately we need a third team to send Tyler Hero. And, whichever team is getting Tyler Hero, what are they sending back to Portland? Like, if it's Brooklyn, are you sending back Ben Simmons? Do the Nets have to give up more stuff than that? Probably, just to get off of the Simmons contract. So you could see where negotiations start to break down once you start expanding these deals. Tim McMahon threw out the Jazz as a potential dark horse.
Weber State.
Yeah, exactly. And, they've got a ton of assets to potentially dangle. They could easily beat Miami's offer. Danny Ainge, Pat Riley, there is no love lost there. So that could be some extra motivation. I know Ramona Shelburne mentioned the Spurs. Again, like they could destroy Miami's offer. They have a ton of young guys. Like Wemby obviously is not going, but, Jeremy Sohan, Devin Vassell, Keldon Johnson, they have a bunch of extra picks they can dangle. I think ultimately, just based on how these things tend to go, I'm guessing he ends up in Miami. I'm guessing Miami sends Tyler Hero to a third team, whether it's Brooklyn or elsewhere. I think that, a lot of this stuff, like these frameworks can make sense on paper, and teams are sometimes just too stubborn to admit it. But like Brooklyn taking Tyler Hero, giving up Ben Simmons, and sending back 2 picks to Portland, like I think Tyler Hero makes sense on that Brooklyn team. Yeah, you're free of the Ben Simmons headache. And from Portland's perspective, you get even more draft capital. And like, what if Ben Simmons isn't broken? And I mean, not entirely likely. But
I mean, you were well versed in that. You know what I mean? You've been there. Yeah.
And like, on a team, no one is going to be paying attention to that Portland team, or no casual fans are going to be paying attention to that Portland team once Dame is gone. So maybe, being out of the spotlight, going from Philly to Brooklyn, where you just have this circus of KD and Kyrie for, a season and a half, go to Portland. Like, you're going to be out of the media spotlight for honestly the first time in your NBA career. You've got 2 seasons to salvage your NBA career before you're up, your current contract expires. Conceptually he might fit well there. So I think there is, much like with the Clippers and the Sixers for Harden, like I think there is a Miami, Brooklyn, Portland framework that could make sense for all 3 teams. It's just, do all 3 teams agree with that? Or is there this dark horse that comes in and, just destroys Miami's offer?
Yeah, I agree with you that from Brooklyn's perspective, Tyler Hero makes sense. And there was a report earlier today that Brooklyn would want, assets back for a Tyler Hero. I think the asset back in this situation would be getting off of the Ben Simmons situation. It's like, you kind of wipe your hands of that entire ordeal. Maybe for your troubles, you get a 2nd round pick. Maybe for on the other side, like you don't have to give a pick in order to get rid of the Ben Simmons situation. Maybe that's your way of winning here. And from Brooklyn's perspective, Tyler Hero next to a bunch of 6'9" wings that can kind of switch and guard multiple positions. I guess defensively, it makes a lot of sense. It fits. And I think, they do have some guards that they have there, like a Cam Thomas, and they just signed Lonnie Walker. So maybe they don't have necessarily the usage, but Hero tops all of those guys, right?
Yeah.
I just think it makes sense fit-wise. And maybe he's a guy who can up his value a little bit more in Brooklyn compared to what he's at with Miami and the new contract starting there. I wouldn't be surprised if New Orleans comes in here as the dark horse because they have a lot of picks. They have a treasure trove of young players that can be, enticing to Portland, whether they decide to include a Trey Murphy or a Dyson Daniels or, Herb Jones just got re-signed, but anybody else on that roster that is, a young prospect that they could send. Kyra Lewis is a guy who potentially wanted to get asked out, but again, he's a guard. I think New Orleans could be that quote unquote dark horse. If we're relating to this to the Raptors and that 2019 Kawhi team, I think they could be that 2019 Raptors Kawhi team where they go out and get Dame. The funny part of this would be, how do you get the contract to work, right? The matching salaries on that perspective. That brings up CJ McCollum, maybe Jonas Valanciunas. And it's just funny because CJ and Dame, they've been teammates before. So, So I don't know, but I could see that being the dark horse. Maybe they just put out a too enticing of a package for the Blazers to, like they can't refuse that type of package, and Dame has to go and play in New Orleans for a couple of years.
Or just like a Dame and Zion challenge trade would be fun.
That would be hilarious.
We just want to wash our hands of Zion. Like, we understand the upside, but we're getting Damian Lillard back, so it's not like we're selling low on him. And Zion next to Scoot and Shaden, if he stays healthy,
he did work out in Portland. Remember when he got sent to Portland to do, I think it was at the Nike facility there, right? So he does technically have a quote unquote tie there, to be able to work, and maybe he can get healthier there in Portland. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. It's funny because we went from the 3rd pick for Zion to, okay, now maybe Dame for Zion.
Right.
That's just funny. So I guess your final bet would still be Miami, that Dame lands in Miami.
Yeah, I think so. He's under contract for a couple more seasons. So, and he doesn't have a no trade clause, as a lot of insiders have been very quick to point out. So it's not a Bradley Beal situation where he can literally force where he goes. But, I think unless another team comes way over the top of Miami, like Portland, I would imagine wants to do right by him. They just don't want to be like, we're taking, absolutely nothing of value back. You have to get something real for Dame, whether it's a prospect or whether it's multiple 1st-round picks. And, like Miami just doesn't have much to offer outside of Hero. I think they can offer 2 firsts. They can offer the kid they just drafted this year. They can offer Nikola Jovic. But like, that's just, even compared to what Minnesota gave up for Rudy Gobert last year, like that is nothing. And much rather have Dame than Rudy Gobert. So I think that's that's the challenge from Miami's perspective, is how do you get to the value that Portland is asking for? I think Hero is, find the third team that's actually willing to give up stuff for Hero.
Yeah. And I wonder, San Antonio, both San Antonio and Brooklyn, they have extra firsts to give.
Yeah.
So depending on how much they value a guy like Tyler Hero, like I could see, San Antonio has Toronto's pick from next year, and that could potentially be a pretty valuable pick, right? If they are interested in a guy like Tyler Hero to add to Vassell, Johnson, Sohan, and now Wemby, I could see them using one of those picks. One pick going over to Portland, maybe a couple of seconds. I know they have a bunch of extra second round picks as well. Some kind of framework like that makes some sense to me. Whether it's Brooklyn or San Antonio, we'll see what happens. But I agree with you that Dame ends up being in Miami. I think it's amicable for both sides, if you will. I think they will try to do right by Dame. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about that. Some people are not happy, on both sides. Loyalty seems to be a really big conversation in the NBA world today nowadays. And it's funny because Harden and Lillard are like the polar opposites of that conversation in a lot of ways. It just feels like those two things happening at the same time has opened up such a big discussion on player movement, player empowerment, and how that kind of shakes out even moving forward. Because Lillard, a guy who's 33 years old, and he has 4 years left on his contract, and he's asking out. And then you have Harden, who's a guy who has 1 year left on his contract, 34 years old, and he's at it. It's provided for a very interesting dialogue on what player empowerment, player movement means for the next whatever amount of years for the NBA, especially with this new CBA.
Yeah. Well, spoiler alert, there is no loyalty in any business, and the NBA is a business. So I hate to break it to everyone, but Dame spent 11 years there, and he gave them plenty of chances. Like, I think the one thing you can realistically bristle at, and this could seg into the free agency talk. He had the meeting with them on Monday, I believe, their front office, and like Dame he's been pretty transparent throughout the last couple months, right? Like, I don't remember in years past him ending the season and being like, okay, I'm done babysitting. Like, we need to win now, or we're going to have a conversation. And he, that was his end of season press conference this year. So like, he had been telegraphing that this was coming if the Blazers didn't make a big upgrade. And I think them jumping to 3 and then Scoot falling to 3, you can't fault the Blazers for passing that up, but that did lead to the, okay, well, what's the move? Like, can you pry Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby out of Toronto? Can you get Karl-Anthony Towns? Like, who is the guy? So, what was happening in that meeting? Like, did Dame say, all right, last chance, like, this is, if you guys don't make a big move by 12 hours into free agency, I'm out of here? Because them re-signing Jeremy Grant to that deal, the 5-year $160 million, more justifiable if you think Dame is coming back now that he's presumably on his way out. It's like, okay, why'd you just hand all that money?
It's the next great albatross contract, albatross, whatever it is. It's the great big, it's the next, Tobias Harris was that for a very long time. Ben Simmons is currently that, right? That is, Jeremy Grant is now the new Tobias Harris, if you will, in a lot of ways. And that's John
Collins,
another
example of like, we can't lose these guys for nothing, so we have to re-sign them. And I don't even mind the amount of money. It's more the years. I think that's going to be the bigger issue.
Yeah, I think money-wise, at least annually, with the new CBA, it's going to be going up like 10% every single year, or at least that's the maximum it could go up. Yeah. I could see the Grant contract, at least annually, not looking as bad in 2 years' time when there's only 3 years left on his contract, and now you're looking at like, okay, maybe it's not as bad. But speaking of Dame's final press conference, he actually said in the press conference that, oh yeah, Jeremy Grant, he's going to be back next year, ladies and gentlemen. That was one thing he promised, and he did it. He got it done. Look, we'll get in. Generational bag getter for his friends. Just incredible. Alan Crabb should be a huge Go search that up, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't. Okay, anyways. We'll talk about free agency now. So there's been some winners and losers. We've only had one weekend, but most of the guys are off the board now. You know, most of the names are off the board, and I think a lot of teams have pretty much finished what they're going to do. Outside of some trades here and there, maybe Toronto shakes things up. That's probably one of the other dominoes to fall. We'll talk about that once we get to that point. But, you know, everybody's going to be watching what Portland does, what Philadelphia does. See, I'm thinking about James Harden. I go straight to Houston.
Houston too, though. We'll get there. But I'm curious. I have some suspicions about Houston.
Fair enough. I think those are rightful suspicions. We'll start with some of the winners. I'll let you go first. Do you have a winner in mind of free agency so far after weekend one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Lakers just getting Austin Reeves back at 4 years, whatever it ends up being, $56 million. You know, they successfully deterred other teams from throwing a big offer sheet at him. Like, they were limited. They signed him to the most amount of money they could offer, but other teams could offer a lot more money because of the Arenas rule. I don't want to bore anyone going into it. You know, if you're curious, just Google Arenas rule Austin Reeves, and you'll find out why. So, you know, being able to get him back for probably 20-30 million less than he otherwise could have gotten was a great piece of business for them. Rui Hachimura at 17 million a year, totally fine. I think, you know, he played extremely well in that run to the Western Conference Finals. Definitely a guy you wanted to keep around. You know, D'Angelo Russell not committing long-term to him, but still bringing him back. Nice piece of business as well. The Gabe Vincent addition, you know, I think it's going to be really good for them, especially after losing Dennis Schroeder. I like the Flyers on Cam Reddish and Jackson Hayes. So, and Taurean Prince as well. So, you know, they meaningfully upgraded their supporting cast without, like, Schroeder was a loss, but, you know, swap him out for Vincent, Reddish, Prince, and Hayes. And, like, I think the Lakers got better this offseason. And I'm also really impressed with the Phoenix Suns. You know, I think after the Bradley Beal trade, there's a lot of question. Like, all right, cool. We know who your top four are. You know, who's playing 5 through 15 on your roster, because they only had minimum deals to hand out since they're over the second apron. And as it turns out, they had some pretty good ideas of who to go after. So, you know, getting Keita Bates-Diop, getting Eric Gordon, of course, Drew Eubanks, brought back Damian Lee, Josh Okogie.
Eric Gordon reuniting in Phoenix finally.
Yep. Yuta Watanabe as well, and Metu as well. Like, you know, for considering how limited they were asset-wise and resource-wise, I think they did about as well as they possibly could have done. So I think those two were my big winners so far, but I think some other teams did well too.
Yeah. You mentioned Phoenix. I think if you were to ask a Suns fan to, before free agency, list their top 10 free agents of who they would like to go for, barring, you know, the restrictions that they had, I would probably guess they got at least 5 of those guys. Maybe 5 of those guys, which is that. I mean, that's really impressive work. You mentioned Bates-Diop. I think he's a nice little upside swing, can kind of be thrown into the rotation here. I know there's some people that are really high on him. Eric Gordon is a guy who's obviously going to be able to space the floor for you. Yuta, I love Yuta and just what he brings on the court. He is never in the wrong spot. That is just like an incredible knack that he has, both on defense and offense. He's just has an incredible awareness to him on the court. So yeah, I agree with you. Suns and Lakers are really, really great winners, if you will, so far in this free agency. I'm going to go to the Eastern Conference for my 2 winners, and I'm actually going to go ahead. And both of these teams are in the same division, the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Indiana Pacers. I really like the fact that the Cavs addressed one of their dire needs, which is movement shooting. George Niang and now Max Strus. I think those are 2 guys that fit in perfectly. Max Strus more than Niang, I think. I think Niang is you have experience in the Niang department as well, but I think like he is a big dude. So yes, he can guard multiple positions, but he's not a guy that you necessarily want to put out there for the defensive end of things.
Right.
I saw that as someone had mentioned. It's like, oh yeah, Niang, he can guard multiple positions. It's like, yeah, but do you want him to?
I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah, right.
The shooting is his selling point for sure.
Exactly, yeah, and like, yes, he is a big body, so maybe he can guard up a position, if you will. But I think the Max Strus signing is great. I think he works well off of their bigs. Like, with Bam Adebayo, he was great in those dribble handoff situations. That sort of applies the same way with Evan Mobley and Jared Allen. The movement shooting is going to look great. He's going to space the floor for guys like Garland and Mitchell. It's just it's a great get. And then on top of that, they had some interesting swings. I think bringing Karis LeVert in at a pretty affordable rate is good. Could potentially be traded at the deadline. I think that's a tradable contract as well. And then some upside swings in Damian Jones and Ty Jerome. And I think like that makes sense to me. Those are guys that kind of fit the build of what the Cavs sort of need around the margins. I think depth was their biggest issue in the playoffs against the Knicks, and they've added some depth here and movement shooting. They addressed their two problems. They're going to go into next season a little bit more formidable, especially as a playoff team. Indiana on the other side, I absolutely love what Indiana did. You bring in Bruce Brown, albeit at a high amount, $22 million. I'm pretty sure on that first year, and the second year is a team option. But regardless, I think Bruce works so well just because of how great of an off-ball mover he is. He's a guy who can cut for you. He's going to work excellent next to Tyrese Halliburton. And then another guy who is a great, addition to this high-flying team is Obi Toppin. They traded for him. I know it technically doesn't count in the free agency world, but it does, and they got him for a really affordable rate. I think it was just 1 second-round pick that they got him for. He's going to look great next to Halliburton. And the Pacers might be one of the best, athletic teams in the NBA next season between Mathurin, between Toppin. They have, I believe, Jarace Walker as well. Jarace Walker, who is just like an athlete in his own right. So they just have a lot of great athletes. So I think they will be like one of the more fun league pass teams to watch, if you will. I think they improved in the Eastern Conference standings as well. They probably look like a playoff or play-in team to me now. But yeah, that's where I stand on my winners. Let's go to the losers. Pick two losers and let's see if we have the same ones. I feel like we probably have the same ones here.
Well, I mean, I think unfortunately Portland, just because of the Dame situation, because of the Jeremy contract, if they end up having to take back the Miami slop, whatever it might end up being, like, I think we're going to look at what they get versus the Gobert haul, and I think Utah is probably going to have gotten more for Gobert, and that just sucks. Getting Scoot is great. Like the future can still be bright in Portland, but just how the last couple months, frankly, unfolded outside of the draft stuff was pretty unfortunate for them. Yeah. I gotta pick your Toronto Raptors as one of the other losers. I mean, just losing Fred VanVleet is a killer, and sure, they got Dennis Schroeder in to replace him, spent the full mid-level on him, but it feels like, I was making a joke with someone yesterday, like the Sixers and the Raptors are both like, let's just run it back, but worse. Like, we're just going to run back most of the same group. But like, the Sixers lost George Niang, Jalen McDaniels, Shake Milton, swapping out Fred VanVleet for Dennis Schroeder. Like, I want to know what the plan is long-term, because you re-sign Jakob Poeltl, 4 years, $80 million. I think it's good value. I think that's a contract that will, not be an albatross at any point, should have good trade value down the road. But, is there another shoe to drop at some point? Is Pascal available? Is OG available? Like, you got a lot of guys coming up on the last year of their deal that, you can't lose them for nothing. You can't do what you just did with Fred VanVleet. So, what is the plan?
I completely agree with you. We have the two same losers in this department. From Portland's perspective, it's just very obvious. And I think there is a silver lining with both of these losers because I think, young core wise, looking forward long term, there's a bigger picture thing here with both of these teams that makes sense. You mentioned it with Portland, with Scoot Henderson, Shaedon Sharpe, Anthony Simons. You can see that in a very short amount of time, that's going to be an exciting basketball team. We talked about We haven't talked about it here today, but on this podcast before, we've talked about Paolo Banchero and the Orlando Magic and how exciting they look. They're going to be a play-in or a playoff team very soon. We've talked about OKC before on this podcast and how they've blossomed. I think you can see, depending on how this Portland Dame trade goes, that Portland will be in a position to be one of those young budding teams very soon, depending on how Scoot plans out, depending on how Shaedon pans out. There's a lot of promise there. And I think that's the one silver lining I would have if I was a Trailblazers fan. It's like, yeah, you're giving up on, the heart and soul of that organization, saying goodbye to arguably the greatest Blazer of all time. But at the same time, there is so much promise on the other side, and you finally picked a direction. And I think that's ironic because with the Raptors situation, as much as if the Raptors were trying to run it back with Fred VanVleet, yes, they are absolute losers in this situation for it's poor asset management in a lot of ways because they let him essentially walk. Their second best player on the team, one of their all-stars, they let him walk. From that perspective, it is huge and it's a big loss. I don't think there's any question about that. There's a lot of debate on Raptors Twitter right now, whether it is a huge loss or not. Some people think the team will actually be better without Fred VanVleet, which is no, Bryan. Thank you. I'm so happy that we got your reaction here from an impartial fan. It is such a ridiculous concept. Yeah, I know. The best shooter on one of the worst shooting teams in the NBA gets removed. And for some reason, in the year 2023, people think that the Raptors will actually have a better field a better team because of it. It is hypocritical. It shows just how much the fan base has turned on a player like Fred VanVleet. It's for a different conversation for another day, but I'm glad we got your reaction here because that is exactly how most people should react to that type of conversation. The other side of this, though, the silver lining, I would say, from a Raptors perspective, is that Fred has now forced them to pick a decision. That he has forced them to pick a side. They cannot run it back. They do not have the facilities, if you will, to run it back and try to be a playoff team. We just mentioned Cleveland has gotten better. Indiana has gotten better. Orlando, by virtue of development and getting better with their youth, has gotten better. Toronto's standing in the Eastern Conference is very quickly getting worse and worse. They do not have their 2024 pick next season. That is San Antonio's. It's top 6 protected. I think they are now in a position where they have to choose a direction. And because of Fred VanVleet walking, they are now forced to pick a direction, which is more of a rebuild, a retool around Scotty Barnes. And to your point, I think that's why we will see most likely at some point this summer, or maybe even, before the trade deadline, a trade for Pascal Siakam. I think that's the next shoe to drop. But it all comes back to Fred making the decision to walk. I guess, where do you stand on Houston? Because we didn't pick them as winners or losers, but where do you kind of stand on what they are after all of this?
I like what they've done, honestly. I think, the Fred contract, it's big. You get sticker shock, but I know there's some report out that the third year is a team option, in which case, okay, cool. He plays out this year. He's all of a sudden he could be an expiring contract. So, my suspicion is that Houston is now trying to get back into the superstar trade market. And you have this young group that can be these blue chip prospects, whether it's Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, Amen Thompson, Tari Eason, Cam Whitmore, who they just got. So they've got some guys that they can dangle now. They just didn't have the salary matching contracts to make it work. Now all of a sudden, all right, you can pair Fred VanVleet with one of these other guys, and that should get you in the door. Like a Dame or James Harden. Obviously, they already passed up. And Dame doesn't really make sense on a team with VanVleet and Amen Thompson. But next summer, who's to say that if things go really south with the Sixers, Joel Embiid doesn't start wanting to look around? Or, I know teams around the league are monitoring Giannis because, what happens if they flame out early in the playoffs again and he doesn't sign this contract extension? What happens if Luka with, the Kyrie stuff, if that goes south? There's always another star right down the road. That's the lesson of the NBA over the past half decade. So I think that's their goal ultimately. And in the meantime, add VanVleet, add Dylan Brooks on a descending deal, the Jock Landale contract. I know everyone freaked out about, but as it turns out, only the first year is fully guaranteed. So, you know, I think that's really just $8 million salary filler. Jeff Green as well, like bringing in these guys to kind of just set the tone for their young guys, I think will be really helpful both from an on and off court perspective. And it's going to help the Rockets figure out which of these young guys are actually keepers. Like, it's hard to evaluate these guys when you're playing, you know, on a 20-win team. You don't really learn that much meaningful about any of them. Now they're competing for minutes with guys like Van Vliet and Brooks. And I think, I mean, you could speak to this better than I can, but, you know, from what I understand, Van Vliet's like a really high character guy, like a good guy to have around young players. So I think, you know, short term, Rockets should be a lot better. And now long term, they've put themselves in the position where, you know, this is the hard part. Like, you get a couple of years to rebuild, you get all these young players. Now it's, all right, we're going to start cashing some of these guys in. If you hit those moves well, you got the foundation of a championship contender, possibly. If you don't, you turn into the Sixers.
And that is a great way to finish this thing off. You, at some point in time, ladies and gentlemen, if things don't go your way, you will turn into the Philadelphia 76ers.
just hire Colangelo, and you'll be right on the elevator down.
Yeah, no, I agree with you when it comes to everything Houston. I think I've liked what they've done. I mean, contract wise, they've allowed themselves some flexibility as long as that team option is actually true and reported for Fred. I think they have a lot of flexibility moving forward. You've mentioned the young guys. I think defensively they'll just be better too. You know, they were one of the more putrid defensive teams last season. I mean, Dame put up 71 points on them. He could have probably put up more. It was an area of concern for them, and adding Brooks, adding Fred, it's going to address a lot of their perimeter issues and just bring some adults in the room. I think it's become a very underrated part of winning in the NBA is just having some adults. I think the Denver Nuggets showed that in a lot of ways when they won the NBA championship. Everybody kept bringing up how important the Ish Smiths and the DeAndre Jordans and the Kentavious Caldwell Popes of the world were. They just said, like, they kind of kept their composure, and it helped them win an NBA championship. So I think vets are going to be very important moving forward in the NBA. Bryan, before we head out, anything you got to plug, anything you got coming before we get out of here?
Yeah, I've written a couple things about the Sixers, whatever they are right now, that whole situation at Forbes Sports, and I'll have something at Liberty Ballers hopefully later this week on that as well. Check out the NBA podcast, wherever podcasts are found. We just had Keith Smith on last night to do something very similar to this, a winners and losers of free agency. So for all the cap nerds out there in particular, I think y'all know already that Keith is one of the best cap minds out there, but some good explanations. You know, you were talking about Indiana earlier and like the Bruce Brown thing might get some sticker shock, but Keith explained, like, you know, now new CBA, you have to hit the salary floor by the first day of the regular season. So I think a lot of these teams were, you know, that might have been part of it for Houston as well. Like, hey, we got $60 million. We got to spend it on someone. Like, you know, we don't really care if we're overpaying Fred VanVleet. So, thank you for having me on, Es. It's always a blast chatting, and hope you enjoy Summer League.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody who's tapped into the Objective Basketball Podcast. As always, from Bryan, from myself, we will see you guys later. Take care.
Follow hosts at Just S Baraheni on all socials and at The Lauren Gunn on Twitter. The Objective Basketball Podcast, delivering the NBA to you like no other.